when 72-year-old widower Harold Bennett receives an email from a Nigerian prince claiming to need urgent help to unlock his royal fortune, his lonely days take an unexpected turn. Drawn by the promise of wealth and the heartfelt appeal, Harold wires his entire pension to a stranger thousands of miles away. But as the truth begins to unravel, the ripple effects of Harold's decision lead to consequences no one could have foreseen, ones that will test the boundaries of trust, love, and redemption. Harold Bennett's life had settled into a monotonous rhythm. At 72, the retired schoolteacher's days were defined by predictable routines. His morning started with a slow walk to the park where he would sit on a worn wooden bench, feeding the birds while reminiscing about days long past. His evenings were spent in silence, save for the ticking of an old clock that once belonged to his late wife, Margaret. His modest home, tucked in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was a shrine to her memory. The familiar surroundings brought comfort and sadness all at once. Loneliness had become Harold's constant companion since Margaret's passing. Though his daughter Emma visited as often as her busy schedule allowed, Harold couldn't shake the profound sense of emptiness that enveloped his days. He tried to fill the void with books, crosswords, and the occasional phone call from an old friend, but the silence always crept back. His laptop, an aging machine that sometimes refused to boot properly, had become his lifeline to the outside world. One rainy afternoon, Harold opened his email to sift through the usual spam and promotional offers. He barely glanced at the clutter filling his inbox. Ads for miracle cures, reminders to upgrade his phone plan, and notices from companies he had never heard of. But one subject line stopped him cold. Urgent. Assistance needed from a kind soul. Intrigued, Harold clicked on the message. It began, "Dear Sir, I hope this email finds you in good health. My name is Prince Adewale Okonjo of Nigeria. I write to you with a heavy heart and great hope. My family's wealth has been seized by corrupt officials. I am in dire need of help from a kind and trustworthy person. In return, I promise to share my family's fortune with you as a token of gratitude. I assure you, this is no scam. Time is of the essence." Harold hesitated. He had heard of scams involving so-called Nigerian princes and their pleas for financial help, but something about this email struck a chord. It was written with sincerity, or at least what felt like sincerity. The tone was different from the exaggerated, clumsy scams he had read about in news reports. And for Harold, who had long since stopped feeling important to anyone, the idea that someone might trust and rely on him sparked an unusual curiosity. "Why not?" he muttered under his breath, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "It's just an email." Harold replied, "Dear Prince Adewale, I'm sorry to hear about your troubles. I don't know how I can help, but I'm willing to listen. Best regards, Harold Bennett." The prince's response came swiftly, a heartfelt thank you that seemed to leap off the screen. Adewale explained his plight in detail. His father had been a prominent philanthropist in Nigeria, building schools and hospitals for impoverished communities. But after his sudden passing, corrupt officials had seized the family's assets. Adewale, the eldest son, had been left to fight for his family's legacy while caring for his younger siblings. Over the following days, Harold and Adewale exchanged a flurry of emails. The prince's words were filled with gratitude and vivid descriptions of his life, his struggles, and his dreams. Harold found himself captivated by the unfolding story. In return, Harold shared his own life experiences, how he met Margaret at a church event, how they built a life together, and how deeply he missed her after she passed. For the first time in years, Harold felt alive. He felt needed. His mundane days now had a spark of excitement as he awaited each new email from Adewale. The prince's words brought color to Harold's otherwise gray existence, and he began to see himself not as an old man nearing the end of his life, but as someone who could make a real difference. Then came the email that would change everything. Adewale explained that he had found a trusted lawyer who could help recover his family's wealth, but there was a hurdle: the legal fees. With no access to his frozen assets, Attewell had no choice but to ask Harold for help. The amount needed was staggering, $200,000. Harold stared at the screen, his heart pounding. His entire pension, painstakingly saved over decades of teaching, amounted to just that sum. It was all he had left to sustain him in his retirement. But as he reread Attewell's email, a sense of duty tugged at him. "You are the only person I can trust," Attewell had written. Harold spent the next several nights consumed by the decision. He barely slept, pacing his small living room and staring at Margaret's photograph on the mantelpiece. What would she do? He thought about the purpose he had felt over the past weeks, the connection he had formed with Attewell. Could he let the prince down now, after everything they had shared? Finally, Harold made his choice. He went to the bank and withdrew his entire pension. As he wired the money to the account provided by Attewell, his hands trembled. He felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, hope, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. As the transaction was confirmed, Harold leaned back in his chair. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds. He told himself it was a sign, that he had done something good. But Harold had no way of knowing what lay ahead. His decision would set in motion a series of events that would forever change his life, and not in the way he imagined. Days turned into weeks after Harold sent the wire transfer. At first, he felt a cautious optimism, as though his leap of faith might truly lead to something extraordinary. He refreshed his email inbox several times a day, eagerly awaiting updates from Prince Attewell. Each time a new message arrived, his heart would leap, only to sink when it turned out to be spam. The silence from Attewell became deafening. Harold tried to rationalize it. Surely a legal process of this magnitude would take time. He imagined Attewell running between government offices, pleading his case to corrupt officials, and negotiating with lawyers. Yet, as the days stretched on without so much as a thank-you email, Harold's confidence began to erode. What if something had gone wrong? One afternoon, after nearly 3 weeks of waiting, Harold decided to send a follow-up email. His fingers trembled as he typed. "Dear Prince Attewell, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to check in and see how things are progressing. Please let me know if there's anything further I can do to help. Best regards, Harold Bennett." He hit send and stared at the screen, willing a reply to appear. Hours passed, and the inbox remained empty. By evening, Harold's unease had turned into full-blown anxiety. He couldn't ignore the growing voice in the back of his mind, whispering that he had made a terrible mistake. The following morning, Harold decided to call Emma. He hadn't told her about the transaction, she would never have approved, but now he felt desperate for her guidance. As the phone rang, he rehearsed how he might explain everything without sounding foolish. "Hi, Dad," Emma's cheerful voice answered. "How are you?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," Harold lied. I wanted to ask your advice on something." Emma immediately picked up on the tension in his voice. "What's wrong?" Harold hesitated, then blurted it out. "I think I've made a mistake. I sent money to someone overseas, a lot of money. He said he was a Nigerian prince who needed help unlocking his family's fortune. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now, I don't know." The line went silent for a moment. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Dad, please tell me you didn't send your savings to a stranger on the internet." Harold felt a pang of shame. "It was my pension," he admitted quietly. "Your entire pension?" Emma's voice rose. "Dad, that's all you have. How could you do something so reckless?" "I believed him," Harold said, his voice breaking. "He sounded so genuine. He needed my help, and I thought I was doing something good." Emma sighed deeply. "Dad, this is a classic scam. You've heard about these before. They prey on people's kindness. We need to go to the bank and report this immediately." Harold felt his chest tighten. The thought of walking into the bank and admitting he had been duped was almost unbearable. "I'll think about it," he muttered, hoping to end the conversation. But Emma was relentless. That afternoon, she showed up at Harold's house unannounced. "We're going to the bank," she declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. Harold reluctantly agreed, and they drove in tense silence. At the bank, Harold explained the situation to the teller, his voice barely above a whisper. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, listened patiently before shaking her head. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Bennett," she said, "but international wire transfers are almost impossible to reverse, especially if they've already been withdrawn." Harold felt the room spin. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. "There's nothing you can do?" he asked, his voice trembling. The teller glanced sympathetically at Emma before replying. "We can file a fraud report, but I have to be honest, the chances of recovering the money are very slim." Emma placed a reassuring hand on Harold's shoulder, but he barely felt it. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. His entire pension was gone, and there was nothing he could do to get it back. Over the next few days, Harold spiraled into a deep depression. He avoided Emma's calls and spent most of his time staring blankly at the television. The house, once filled with the warmth of Margaret's memory, now felt suffocating. Harold replayed every moment of his interaction with Adewale, scrutinizing the emails for signs he should have noticed. How could he have been so blind? One evening, as Harold sat in the dim light of his living room, the doorbell rang. He ignored it at first, assuming it was a solicitor. But the ringing persisted, followed by a knock. Harold shuffled to the door and opened it to find Emma standing there, holding a laptop. "I've been doing some research," she said, brushing past him into the house. "We're not giving up yet." Harold watched as Emma set the laptop on the coffee table and pulled up a website. "There's a group that tracks these kinds of scams," she explained. "They help people report cases like yours, and sometimes even find the scammers." Harold stared at the screen, his hope flickering faintly. "You think they can help me?" Emma nodded. "It's worth a shot." For the first time in weeks, Harold felt a glimmer of hope. As Emma began filling out the online report, he realized he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. But as they pressed "Submit," Harold couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long and painful journey. The online report Emma submitted didn't sit idle for long. Within days, Harold received an email from an investigator with an organization dedicated to cyber fraud recovery. The message was both encouraging and sobering. While they had seen countless cases like Harold's, only a handful ever resulted in recovered funds. Still, they promised to investigate and keep him updated. Harold clung to that sliver of hope, but he couldn't stop the gnawing sense of guilt. He spent hours rereading Adewale's emails, searching for clues he might have missed. Every phrase that once seemed sincere now felt like a calculated lie. How had he fallen for it? He often replayed the conversations with Adewale in his head, dissecting them word by word, hoping to uncover the moment where he should have stopped trusting. Emma became Harold's lifeline. She visited daily, bringing groceries and trying to coax him into conversation. One afternoon, she arrived with a folder of printouts. "I did some digging," she said, sitting at the kitchen table. "These scammers don't act alone. It's a network. They target vulnerable people, mostly the elderly. All they need is one person to bite." Harold winced. "And I was the one." "You're not the only one," Emma said gently. "These people are professionals, but we'll do everything we can to stop them." Emma showed Harold examples of other scams orchestrated by similar networks. There were stories of people who had lost their life savings, just like Harold, and others too ashamed to report what happened. Harold realized he was part of a much larger problem, a global web of deceit designed to exploit trust. A week later, Harold received another email from the investigator. This time, it contained a lead. The account Harold had sent money to was tied to a larger operation in Lagos, Nigeria. The organization had been flagged before, but its members used fake names and accounts to avoid capture. The investigator explained law enforcement agencies in multiple countries were involved, but progress was slow. "We need more information," the email read. "If you have additional correspondence or receipts, please send them. It could help trace their activities." Harold forwarded everything but felt like reopening a wound. Emma assured him he was doing the right thing. "You're helping build a case," she said. "Even if they don't recover your money, you'll stop them from hurting someone else." For the first time, Harold felt a spark of purpose. He began to see himself not just as a victim, but as someone who could help. He started researching scams and attending support groups Emma found. There, he met others who had been defrauded. Together, they shared their experiences and found strength in knowing they weren't alone. Then, one evening, Harold received a call from a reporter for a national news outlet. "Mr. Bennett, I'm working on a story about scams targeting retirees," the reporter explained. "I found your case through the recovery group. Would you share your story?" Harold hesitated. The thought of exposing his mistake was terrifying, but Emma encouraged him. "If your story helps even one person avoid this, it's worth it," she said. A week later, Harold sat for an interview in his living room. He spoke candidly about his experience, his regret, and his determination to prevent others from falling into the same trap. The article was published online and quickly gained traction. Harold's story struck a chord with readers, many of whom reached out with support, or their own stories of being scammed. The attention brought something unexpected: leads. Several readers recognized the scam details. One email stood out. A man in London claimed he had been contacted by someone using the same name, Prince Edawale, but cut off communication after suspecting a scam. He shared the emails with Harold's investigator. The investigator followed up and discovered a pattern. The scammers used aliases but followed the same script, exploiting trust and disappearing as soon as they succeeded. The evidence began to pile up, and law enforcement in the UK and Nigeria took notice. One evening, Harold received another email from the investigator. "Good news," it read. "We've identified members of the network and are working with authorities to make arrests. While we can't promise financial recovery, your case has been critical to this investigation." Harold shared the news with Emma, who hugged him tightly. "See," she said, "you made a difference." But even as the investigation gained momentum, Harold couldn't shake the bitterness. His pension was gone, along with the financial security he and Margaret had built. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time since the scam, he felt something he hadn't in months: hope. As Harold prepared for bed that night, he glanced at Margaret's photograph on his nightstand. "I'm doing my best," he whispered. "I hope you'd be proud." He climbed into bed, knowing the fight wasn't over but feeling he had reclaimed part of his dignity and helped others avoid his fate. The arrests made headlines across multiple countries. Harold couldn't believe it when Emma showed him the news. Photographs of suspects in handcuffs flashed on the screen, tied to a global fraud network. For a brief moment, Harold felt vindicated. His case had helped bring these criminals to justice. But the victory felt hollow. Harold's lost pension was still gone, and starting over financially at his age was overwhelming. Emma noticed his slump as they sat at the kitchen table that evening. "You've done something incredible, Dad," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "You helped bring them to justice. That's worth something." Harold nodded, but his eyes lingered on the pile of bills stacked on the counter. Even with Emma's support, the financial strain was crushing. He had already sold his car and begun renting out the spare bedroom in his house to make ends meet. Each adjustment felt like another reminder of how far he'd fallen. A week later, Harold received an unexpected letter in the mail. It bore the seal of an international banking institution and was addressed to him personally. His hands trembled as he opened it. The letter explained that as part of the investigation, several accounts tied to the fraud network had been frozen. While much of the money remained untraceable, a small portion had been recovered. The amount listed wasn't anywhere near what Harold had lost, but it was something. Harold shared the news with Emma, who beamed. "See? It's not everything, but it's a start," she said. Harold tried to smile, but the bitterness lingered. He couldn't help but wonder how many others would never see a cent of what they had lost. The following day, Harold received a call from the fraud investigator. "Mr. Bennett, I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation," the investigator said. "Your case provided crucial evidence that led to these arrests. I know it doesn't erase what happened, but your courage has helped us stop these criminals." Harold thanked him, but didn't feel heroic. That evening, as he browsed the internet, he came across a video of a man giving a talk about overcoming adversity. The speaker, a former scam victim, spoke about rebuilding his life by helping others. Inspired, Harold decided he couldn't let his story end with the investigation. He began preparing to speak at community centers and senior groups, sharing his experience to educate others about online scams. Emma helped him create a slideshow and contact organizations. Harold's first talk was nerve-wracking, but as he recounted his story, he noticed people nodding in understanding. Several attendees thanked him afterward, sharing their own stories. For the first time in months, Harold felt a sense of purpose. Word of Harold's talk spread, and soon he was invited to speak at larger venues. He partnered with the local police to distribute pamphlets on scam awareness. A regional news station aired a segment about his journey. Letters poured in from people inspired by his story. One evening, Harold received a letter from an elderly woman. "Your story saved me," it read. "When I received an email asking for help, I remembered your advice and deleted it. I can't thank you enough." Harold read the letter aloud to Emma, his voice thick with emotion. "I think Margaret would be proud," Emma said softly. Harold nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. Despite his impact, Harold struggled to forgive himself. He often woke in the night, haunted by the memory of wiring his pension away. Emma encouraged him to speak to a counselor. Reluctantly, Harold agreed. In his sessions, he explored the loneliness that had made him vulnerable. The counselor helped him see his desire to help others as a strength, not a weakness. As the months passed, Harold continued his outreach. He joined advocacy groups and pushed for stricter regulations on wire transfers. His efforts led to an invitation to speak at a national cybercrime prevention conference. The conference was the largest audience Harold had ever addressed. As he stood backstage, waiting to be introduced, he felt a mixture of nerves and pride. When his name was called, Harold stepped onto the stage and looked out at the packed auditorium. He began his speech by recounting his experience, the pain of being scammed and the shame he had felt. But as he spoke, he shifted to the lessons he had learned and the resilience he had discovered. "We live in a world where trust can be exploited," Harold said, his voice steady. "But even when we lose, we can find ways to turn our losses into something meaningful. We can still make a difference." The audience erupted in applause as Harold concluded his speech. As he stepped off the stage, Emma met him with a hug. "You're incredible, Dad," she said. Harold smiled, finally believing it. That night, as Harold sat on his porch under the stars, he felt a peace he hadn't known in months. The road ahead would have challenges, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future, for himself and others who needed his story to light their way. Months had passed since Harold gave his speech at the National Cybercrime Prevention Conference. His life had found a new rhythm, one that revolved around his advocacy work and the small victories it brought. He had settled into his role as a mentor to other victims and a trusted voice in scam awareness. It was fulfilling, but the sting of his financial loss and lingering guilt still haunted him in quiet moments. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit alone in the living room and replay the decision to wire away his pension, wishing he could go back and stop himself. One cold morning, as Harold sat at his kitchen table sipping coffee, the phone rang. The caller ID displayed a number he didn't recognize. Hesitant, Harold answered. "Hello? Mr. Bennett, my name is Jonathan Ames. I'm a representative for an international fraud recovery firm," the voice on the other end said. Harold's grip tightened on the phone. "We've been contacted by authorities working on the case related to your pension scam. I wanted to speak with you directly." Harold's heart raced. "Is this about the arrests?" "Not exactly," Jonathan said. "We've been tasked with reviewing accounts tied to the fraud network. During our audit, we discovered a secondary fund scammers used to store surplus money. Some transactions we traced match your case. There's a possibility you may be eligible for partial restitution." Harold nearly dropped the phone. "Restitution? How much are we talking about?" "I can't make any guarantees," Jonathan replied. "The recovered funds are limited and will be distributed among multiple victims. But your case is a priority. We'll need additional documentation to verify the claim." Harold jotted down the details, his mind reeling. Could this be real? After resigning himself to the loss, the idea of recovering even a fraction of his pension felt surreal. When he hung up, Harold immediately called Emma. "Do you think it's legitimate?" Harold asked. Emma was cautious. "It sounds promising, but we should verify everything. Let's research the firm before you send anything." Together, Harold and Emma spent the afternoon combing through records about the fraud recovery firm. Everything checked out. Encouraged, Harold gathered documents Jonathan requested: bank statements, email records, and the police report. As he scanned the files, he felt a glimmer of hope take root. A week later, Jonathan called again. "Mr. Bennett, I have good news," he said. "Your claim has been approved. The restitution amount is $38,000. While it doesn't cover your full loss, it's significant." Harold was speechless. $38,000 wouldn't restore his pension entirely, but it was more than he ever expected. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "You've already said enough, Mr. Bennett," Jonathan replied. "Your cooperation made this possible." The restitution process took a few weeks, but when the check arrived, Harold held it like a lifeline. Emma was there, and they hugged tightly. "This is a fresh start, Dad," she said. Harold nodded, but he was cautious. He had learned too much about trust and life's unpredictability to feel fully at ease. Still, the money meant he could pay off debts and stop renting out his spare bedroom. It wasn't complete normalcy, but it was breathing room, a momentary reprieve from the weight of his loss. The restitution gave Harold new momentum. He used part of the money to fund a scam awareness campaign, distributing brochures and organizing workshops. He collaborated with a nonprofit to create an online hub for scam prevention featuring tips, testimonials, and reporting links. Harold began to feel that his story was making an impact, especially as more victims reached out to him. One day, Harold received an email from a woman in Manila. "Your story gave me the courage to report a scam I was too embarrassed to tell anyone about," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me I'm not alone." Harold read the email aloud to Emma, tears welling in his eyes. "Every time I think I've done enough, something like this reminds me why I started," he said. Despite successes, Harold's nights were restless. The scars ran deep, but he came to accept them, a reminder of both vulnerability and strength. He attended more counseling sessions, learning to forgive himself fully for the mistake that had brought him to this point. "You trusted someone because you wanted to do good," his counselor told him. "That's not a failure, that's humanity." One evening, Harold received another call. This time, it was the lead investigator. "Mr. Bennett, the last suspects in the fraud ring have been apprehended. This wouldn't have been possible without your cooperation." Harold thanked the investigator, feeling closure wash over him. It wasn't just about money or arrests anymore. It was about reclaiming himself and turning his pain into something greater. Later that night, Harold sat on his porch, gazing at the stars. The check was tucked safely away, and emails from those he'd helped were stored in a folder he reread often. For the first time in what felt like forever, Harold felt something he thought he'd lost. Peace. He glanced at Margaret's photograph beside him. "I think I'm finally getting it right," he whispered. For the first time, he truly believed it. The first anniversary of the scam had arrived, but Harold wasn't the same man he had been a year ago. The crushing weight of shame and loss that had once consumed him was now replaced with a sense of purpose. Although the scars remained, they had become reminders of the strength and resilience he had built along the way. Harold spent the morning of the anniversary organizing a community workshop on scam prevention. Emma had helped him plan the event, and it was their largest yet. The local library's conference room was packed with attendees, ranging from retirees to young adults. Harold stood at the front of the room, his presentation ready, but he felt no nervousness this time. "Thank you all for being here," Harold began, his voice strong and steady. "A year ago, I was in a very different place. I was ashamed, angry, and hopeless. But I learned that even the worst mistakes can be transformed into something meaningful. Today, I want to share not just my story, but the tools to protect yourselves and your loved ones from those who prey on our trust." As Harold spoke, he noticed the audience's reactions. Some nodding in agreement, others furrowing their brows in recognition of the tactics he described. At the end of the presentation, several people approached Harold to thank him personally. One older man said, "You've opened my eyes. I almost fell for something like this last month. Because of you, I know what to watch for now." Emma beamed with pride as she watched her father speak with attendees, answering their questions with patience and care. "You're doing something incredible, Dad," she said as they packed up the materials after the event. Harold smiled, feeling the truth in her words. Later that evening, Harold received an email from the nonprofit he had partnered with for his scam awareness campaign. They wanted to expand the initiative nationally, using Harold's story and expertise as the foundation. The idea overwhelmed him at first, but Emma encouraged him to take the leap. "Your voice has made a difference here. Imagine how many more people you could help," she said. Over the next few months, Harold worked tirelessly to build the national campaign. He traveled to different cities, spoke at conferences, and appeared on local news programs to raise awareness. Each interaction felt like a step toward reclaiming not just his dignity, but his identity. He wasn't just the man who had been scammed. He was now someone making a tangible difference. One day, Harold received a handwritten letter from a young woman in Cebu. She wrote about how her elderly father had almost sent money to someone claiming to be a distressed relative. "We were able to stop it in time because of what you shared," the letter read. "You've saved us from losing everything. Thank you." Harold held the letter for a long time, letting the words sink in. Back at home, Harold began organizing the letters, emails, and messages he had received over the past year. He placed them into a scrapbook, each one a testament to the lives he had touched. He titled it, "A New Legacy," a reminder of how far he had come and how much he had to offer. One afternoon, as Harold sat on his porch flipping through the scrapbook, Emma joined him with a cup of tea. "You've turned something awful into something amazing, Dad," she said. "Mom would be so proud of you." Harold looked at the photo of Margaret on the table beside him. "I think she'd like knowing we're helping people," he said. "She always believed in second chances, and I've been given one." Emma leaned over and hugged him. "You've done more than make a difference. You've inspired people, including me." The following year, Harold was honored with a Community Service Award for his work in scam prevention. Standing on the stage accepting the plaque, he reflected on the journey that had brought him there. He addressed the audience with the same sincerity and strength that had carried him through his darkest days. "I've learned that no matter how big a mistake feels, it doesn't have to define you," Harold said. "We all have the power to turn pain into purpose. My hope is that none of you ever have to experience what I did. But if you do, know this: you're not alone, and you can rise from it." The audience gave Harold a standing ovation. Emma wiped away a tear as she watched her father smile, the weight of the past finally lifting. That night, back on the porch, Harold sat with his scrapbook and a cup of tea. The stars were bright and the air was crisp. He felt an overwhelming sense of peace, not just with the world, but with himself. As he looked up at the night sky, he spoke softly to the photograph of Margaret. "We're doing okay now," he said. "I hope you can see that." For the first time, Harold felt the freedom to look forward rather than back. He wasn't defined by his mistake, but by the life he had built from it. And in that moment, he knew he had created a legacy Margaret would have been proud of.